Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to UNICEF's session on a transition also just for children, risk and opportunities. My name is Maria Pia Bianchetti, and I'm a policy and advocacy specialist on child rights and business at UNICEF. Yesterday, we had OECHR session on access to remedy in the energy transition sector. And this afternoon, we continue diving in this topic, and we will explore it from the perspective of child rights. Transitioning to a greener economy is necessary and needs to be done quickly to address the disproportionate consequences of climate change on children. However, as we heard in yesterday's sessions, how this transition happens matters. There are unintended consequences with the transition to a green economy through business efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And these unintended consequences need to be prevented if we are to ensure a livable planet and a fair society and economy to current and future generations. So this is where the work around just transition comes into play. Just transition entails all those public policies and business actions to deal with these unintended consequences. Their goal is to ensure that nobody is left behind. Recently, there has been increasing attention and a number of initiatives aimed at ensuring a fair, just, and equitable green transition. However, attention to children's rights and their views in government and business action on just transition so far is scarce. But this is not for lack of relevance of children's rights in this topic. Children's rights are critical rights holders and stakeholders for both governments and business in the context of climate change and business and human rights. Last year, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child released a general comment on children's rights and the environment with a special focus on climate change. There, it clarified state obligations and provided recommendations for businesses. The list is long of these recommendations, so I pick up a few of these that resonate most for me for today's session. First of all, the committee clarifies that states should equitably phase out the use of coal, oil, and natural gas, ensure a fair and just transition of energy sources, and invest in renewable energy, energy storage, and energy efficiency to address the climate crisis. So it clearly highlights that the transition to a green economy needs to go hand in hand with a just and equitable transition. The committee also reaffirmed once again that states should protect against the abuse of child rights and environmental damage by third parties, including by regulating business, which includes requiring businesses to conduct child rights due diligence, ensuring they rapidly reduce their emissions, ensuring access to justice pathways for children, and we had a session on access to justice for children at the beginning of the session, and integrating child rights risk assessment in standards and procedures for new environment-related projects. The committee also recommends that states that have substantial fossil fuel industries should assess the social and economic impact on children of their related decisions. With regard to business, the committee reaffirms once again that businesses have the responsibility to respect children's rights in relation to the environment. Businesses should conduct due diligence that integrate child rights in partnership with stakeholders, which include children. And businesses are expected to establish or participate in effective grievance mechanisms for children. I'm excited to be joined today by this panel, who will contribute to the discussion on the need to integrate children's rights in just transition strategies and actions, and who will provide their insights on the challenges and possible solutions and opportunities. So we will first hear from Anitra Varia, South Asia researcher and representative at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, who will provide an overview of progress in just transition. We will then have Pichamon Iopantong, member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, who will be talking about the business and human rights challenges in just transition, with a focus on the Asia-Pacific region and particular focus in access to justice and remedy. Tran Lani, representative of UNICEF Regional Young People's Action Team, will share her thoughts and perspective about children and young people in the just transition agenda. Finally, I will share some initial perspective from UNICEF on child rights in just transition. And then at the end, we will want to hear from you, and we will have a few questions to guide the discussion. So without further ado, Anitra, could you share insights into the work of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center is doing on just transition and the progress observed in terms of their impact on affected and vulnerable communities? Thank you.
Thank you, Mary-Pia. I apologize. I've just suddenly picked up an issue with my throat. It just happens, doesn't it? Just before you speak, something happens. I have to admit, I do feel like a bit of an imposter sitting up here in front of all of you child rights specialists and young people, because I'm neither a child rights specialist or a young person. That ship sailed quite a while ago. But I work for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Resource Center, we are a not-for-profit that was founded in 2002. We play a constructive role at the heart of global business and human rights movements to create conditions of shared security and shared prosperity. The Resource Center is the only not-for-profit that highlights the social and environmental impacts of over 10,000 companies in 10 languages. At the Resource Center, we focus on 3 problems: inequalities of power and wealth, poor and unaccountable governance, and the crime breakdown. We approach this from 3 thematic focuses: the rights of workers in global supply chains, the rights of people to accountable digital technologies, and the rights of communities seeking responsible natural resource use and a just energy transition, which is what I hope to discuss today. I'd like you to take a moment and just imagine what it would be like in a world where, in the pursuit of clean energy, we are deepening human rights abuses and furthering marginalization of vulnerable communities. This may seem an impossibility, but it is an unfolding reality across the globe. While we urgently do need to transition to RE to combat the climate crisis, we must ensure that this transition does not perpetuate exploitative practices. At the Resource Center, much of our work is centered around and focused on the energy transition. We look at ensuring that the shift to renewable energy is just and equitable. However, the lessons we learn from this work and apply broadly can be taken for any just transition encompassing changes in industry, economic systems, labor structures, and must be built on 3 fundamental principles, which you can see on the screen actually, which are shared prosperity, human rights and social protection, and fair negotiation. Before we examine the work that the Resource Center has done on a just transition, I'd like to present a little bit of context for you and ask you to consider 2 facts. Marginalized communities, particularly indigenous communities, rural workers, and young people, are disproportionately affected by renewable energy projects due to historic injustices, systemic exclusion, and limited access to resources. Some of these factors that I'd like you to keep in mind is historical land dispossession. Many communities have been long dispossessed from ancestral lands, and with the rise of these RE projects, such as mining for transition minerals, dams, hydroelectric projects, these communities are further displaced. They often lack the legal recognition. Thank you so much. That's all right. They often lack legal recognition of their land rights, and this exacerbates the risk of exploitation. Limited access to decision-making. None of these communities are ever at the table. Their voices are never heard. So marginalized communities are frequently excluded from consultations, allowing corporations, and let's be honest, also governments, to bypass or ignore concerns. In terms of cultural and spiritual erosion, the Resource Center works quite a bit with indigenous communities. And for indigenous peoples, land is not just a resource, but part of their culture and spiritual identity. Projects that disrupt their land, such as large-scale mining or dam construction, inflict not only material loss, but also deep spiritual harm. Our tools, the Transition Mineral Tracker and Renewable Energy Benchmark, help shed light on human rights risks tied to the energy transition. Some key messages from our RE benchmark, which was published in 2021, are that a rapid overhaul of global energy systems is critical to contain the climate crisis and ensure the energy transition delivers the 3 key principles of a just transition. While the RE sector has made progress in adopting broad human rights policies, it falls short in addressing salient human rights risks. RE companies must rapidly close the gap between policy and practice. Some key findings that have been quite troubling to me, honestly, is that 26 out of the 28 companies either do not mention or have no commitments whatsoever anchored in the UNGP. No company has processes in place to identify indigenous or marginalized groups. No project developer has made a public commitment at policy level to identify potential benefit and ownership sharing models. Only 2 companies disclose actions to support local energy access and affordability to communities that live near companies' wind and solar projects. But in saying that, all is not lost. We have seen significant gains since the benchmark was published in 2021. And in 2023, we noted that 3/4 of top wind and solar project developers have strong human rights policies. All developers have grievance mechanisms for workers, and 2/3 of project developers have also made these mechanisms available for external stakeholders. 8 companies now have, and this is compared to none in 2021, have in place policies specifically to reduce environmental defenders. Our transition mineral tracker now records 510 allegations of human rights abuses between 2010 and 2022. This accounts for a total of 1,468 human rights impacts. The leading category, as you can see on the screen above you, is to do with local communities, CSOs, and leaders. This accounts for almost nearly 2/3 of allegations, with 49 of these being for indigenous communities and 25 associated with free, prior, and informed consent. And for me, the most horrifying finding was that 2/3 of these allegations are related to just 14 companies worldwide. Through our work on the benchmark and also the transition mineral tracker, we've put together a number of case studies. Some do make the situation seem quite bleak, but we do have a few case studies that might actually give us a little bit of hope in terms of a just transition. In the Arunachal Pradesh in India, the proposed dam, Siang Dam, is a major hydroelectric project that threatens to displace the Adi tribe. Now, this community has been resident in this area for hundreds of years, and for over 15 years, they have been resisting the project because they fear flooding, earthquakes, and the destruction of not only their homes, but their culture as well. Despite this resistance, the Indian government continues to push forward, militarizing the area and intimidating local populations. This case highlights the dangers of RE projects that disregard free, prior, and informed consent and the rights of local communities. Also in India, a 15-megawatt solar project in Assam led to serious allegations of land rights violations. An independent fact-finding committee found that indigenous villagers had been forcibly evicted. This case underscores the importance of proper land acquisition procedures and overlooking the rights of local communities. And like I said, all is not lost. We have a few positive examples as well. So Mahindra Susten, which is a renewable energy project or company in India also, in Karjat, India, has built something called a Center of Excellence. Here, the center focuses on upskilling economically disadvantaged populations, and we've seen quite a number of youth being involved in this project, with 4,700 individuals trained as technicians in their solar systems. This shows the potential of RE projects and companies to reduce social inequalities by investing in skills development and prioritizing marginalized communities like youth. I'd like to end with a few recommendations that we've come to through our benchmark and our transitional mineral tracker. The recommendations are to government, to investors, and to business. To governments, we ask that they develop policies that integrate human rights and social justice into all aspects of energy transition, enforce free, prior, and informed consent, and ensure meaningful consultation with indigenous communities, provide financial and technical support to communities transitioning or impacted by this clean energy transition, develop and implement frameworks that ensure child rights are considered in all energy transition plans and policies, focusing on their right to a clean and safe environment. For investors, prioritize investments in companies with strong human rights records. Use your leverage to press companies to adopt sustainable practices. Conduct rigorous due diligence to identify and mitigate human rights risks. Include child rights assessments in due diligence processes to identify potential impacts on children in affected communities. And finally, for businesses, respect indigenous land and resource rights, as well as marginalized communities' rights. Embed human rights due diligence across supply chains. Build equitable partnerships with local communities offering benefit sharing and ownership opportunities. And finally, develop strategies to engage children as stakeholders in decision-making processes and ensure their voices are heard regarding projects affecting their communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anitra, for giving us this overview of what progress we've seen so far on just transition. And now, Pichamun, in 2000. Face, including those who are in vulnerable situations, such as children, to access remedy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for providing the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights with this opportunity to be part of a very important session. I have to say, I feel oftentimes that when we talk about children's rights, everyone agrees, obviously, that they are incredibly important, that they must be protected, that they must be respected at all costs. And yet, one cannot help but feel that when you look at what's happening in reality on the ground, there is such pervasive tokenism. There is a tendency for, whether it be businesses or states or even those who are operating in the civil society sector, to say that, yes, we must take into consideration the lived experiences of children, of youths as well. And yet, when you look at the actual programming, or when you look at the actual efforts that have been taken, the presence of children's voices, the visibility of their experiences tend to still be lacking. And so that's where I'm going to start, which is really encouraging all of us. I mean, if you're participating in this session today, it means that you are thinking actively about these issues. And the fact that we have this session in this forum is already a step in the right direction, needless to say, and UNICEF has been doing amazing work in this space. But I do think that we constantly have to ask ourselves, as practitioners and experts in the business and human rights community, are we listening to the voices of children? Where are children in the business and human rights agenda? And what more must we do? Because the road ahead is still a very long and complicated and difficult one. And so in view of the just transition, in other opportunities, I and other members of the working group have repeatedly emphasized how the energy transition is one that cannot just be a transition. It needs to be one that is predicated on a human rights approach. It is one that needs to take into consideration the adverse impacts that projects in the renewable energy sector, in the critical minerals extraction sector, the adverse impacts that these sectors are having on communities, on indigenous peoples, who are the most disproportionately affected by all of these various developments. And it is quite ironic in some respects that the drive that we see towards ensuring that we still have a planet at the end of the day, to ensure that climate change is being systematically addressed, a lot of that has been fueled by the passion, by the commitment of young people everywhere, including in the Asia-Pacific region. And yet again, when we look at the business and human rights agenda, we do not see enough young voices being represented in these discussions and in forging the way forward. I mean, in contrast to the previous speaker, to my colleague on this session, even though the ship has long sailed in terms of my ability to regard myself as a young person, I would like to still think that I am young at heart, and that would still qualify me in some ways. And I have to say that, you know, we keep saying that children's voices need to be adequately represented. But in many respects, we are yet to fully consider what that representation needs to look like, what it means to build that representation into the various grievance mechanisms that we see at the state level, at the operational level for individual businesses. And so this is, I guess, to make my remarks a bit more systematic, let me focus on what it means for there to be a child rights-based approach and how this is still very much lacking. How do we counter these tendencies towards box ticking and tokenism? Because that is still, again, very much an issue. And then also I would like to spotlight the importance of intersectionality in all of this. Because when we consider the experiences of young people, of children, who are indigenous in particular, the ones who are arguably at the greatest risk of an energy transition that is far from just, that is far from sustainable as we currently see it unfold in the Asia-Pacific region, these are the stakeholder groups, but rather these are the rights holder groups that we should be paying immense attention to. So firstly, on the point about the lack of a child rights-based approach, I mean, the children's rights and business principles offer a very clear framework with respect to how businesses, as well as states, can better integrate the experiences and the voices of children into the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And we need to see these principles adopted. We need to see them promulgated and disseminated, not only by the working group, by UNICEF, but equally by businesses themselves and by governments. We need to see capacity building around the children's rights and business principles. And we need to see grievance mechanisms in particular take them into consideration in order to ensure that the best interests of the child are being protected and respected, and that when children are impacted adversely by business operations in the energy sector, that these remedies are actually designed and that they meet the needs and they address the harms that children are facing. But it's also the case that when it comes to grievance mechanisms in particular, these need to actually be accessible. If we think about the effectiveness criteria, it is about legitimacy, it is also about a range of other things, but accessibility ranks very highly in terms of what makes a grievance mechanism functional. And so unless these mechanisms can be directly accessed by children, and accessed by their parents, by their caregivers, and community members to act on their behalf, then we cannot say that the current remedial system that we see in place in the Asia-Pacific region as a whole, but certainly at the level of individual countries, that there is enough progress being made. Indeed, when the working group went to Japan for a country visit, we encountered, and this is slightly beyond the case of just transition, but it is indicative of the problems that we see. Because in Japan, we were faced with having to contend with a specific case that involved the abuse, the sexual abuse and exploitation of children in the media and entertainment industry. And following on from that, in our conversations with stakeholders and also with the victims in this particular case, we constantly heard how the reporting mechanisms, the grievance mechanisms in place are just wholly inadequate because children can't even access them without their parents, for instance. There needs to be a way in which children can pick up the phone and actually call someone or report the harm that they have endured to someone without necessarily requiring that adult supervision at all times. It was also the case that, when it comes to these processes, we need to place the trust in the children as well. We cannot simply assume that because they are children, they do not know any better. That is a problem. When it comes to these grievance mechanisms and ensuring that they work, the burden of proof of evidence needs to be on the business. It needs to be on the actors that are allegedly perpetuating those harms, not on the victims, not on the children in this case. And so a child rights-based approach is one that, again, needs to be realistic about the barriers that children currently face and needs to be systematic in unpacking, dismantling those barriers, and in particular ensuring that children have access to effective remedies too. In relation to box ticking and tokenism, I think this is a problem that we see recurring across the business and human rights landscape. But again, I wanted to address it at the very outset because I feel for many of us, we all agree that children's rights are incredibly important. We can agree that when it comes to business and human rights, their voices need to be represented. But and I'm being self-critical here, when we look at the sessions, let's say, that we organize at the forum here in Bangkok, but also in Geneva, how many of them integrate children, people who represent the young people, the future for all of us? And the answer is not enough, right? So this is where, even with respect to small actions that we can take as a community, this is where we also need to change our own mindsets and our own attitudes. And I think that's the first step towards addressing the more profound issue of box ticking and tokenism that we see. And I also wanted to address, in the time remaining, the issue of intersectionality. As said previously, if you look at indigenous children and young peoples, they are the ones who stand to be the most at risk of the energy transition, one that is exploitative and one that does not respect the cultural identities, the impacts on cultural identity that stem from displacement that indigenous peoples face in relation to, major extractive projects or renewable energy infrastructure projects and the like. And this is where, earlier last week, I had the privilege of being part of the regional conference highlighting the voices of indigenous women and youth for a just and sustainable energy transition. And as part of that conference, there is a declaration that sets out what needs to happen in order for the just transition to be truly just and for it to be inclusive of women and also of young people. And here I would like to take the opportunity to share here those recommendations. So the very first one is that states and businesses need to recognize and respect indigenous peoples' rights, especially the right to free, prior, and informed consent. And this is especially needed in relation to women and youths. And specifically for businesses, it is important for them to acknowledge indigenous peoples, indigenous youths as rights holders and equal partners, rather than as mere stakeholders in the design and implementation of energy transition initiatives. The other key recommendation that I think is worth spotlighting here from the regional conference is one that recognizes as well the traditional justice system of indigenous peoples and the need to strengthen access to justice and remedy, especially for those who often are less heard, including in indigenous communities themselves. And again, here it's the women, it's the children, it's the youths. So taking this all into consideration, I think it charts a way forward for us with respect to what needs to happen next. And I know that we're going to be discussing this more over the course of this session. But it's also very clear that the challenges that lie ahead are major ones, not least because, again, what we currently see in relation to the energy transition, it's not really as just or as inclusive or as sustainable as it needs to be. And I think ultimately all of this, it's about ensuring that the power asymmetries that we see in this space between businesses and communities, but also within communities themselves, between the adults and the children. And I don't want it to be a polarizing characterization of those relationships, but unfortunately in many cases there are power asymmetries that prevent children from being able to fully give voice to their grievances, to their concerns, and that prevent them from being fully heard. And it's on that point that I'll conclude my remarks and reiterate that for the working group, we very much value the contributions of children of youths, of people who are young at heart, but that's just for me. But certainly we value their contributions, and we acknowledge that we wouldn't be having many of these conversations today about the just transition or about climate change if it weren't because of the bravery that we see our future generation demonstrate. Even in countries where it's very difficult to be a human rights defender, we see young people leading the charge and taking at their own personal risk, at their own personal expense, the burden that we, as the current generation, should be shouldering. I think for us to respect the rights of children as part of the business and human rights agenda, we need to ensure that the responsibility and indeed the obligation to respect and protect their rights isn't being derogated to the children themselves, but is in fact being fulfilled by those of us who are supposed to be protecting them. So on that note, I'll hand it back over to the moderator, and thank you very much again for giving the working group this space.
Thank you, Pichomon, for really reinstating the need to apply a child rights-based approach to the business and human rights agenda, the need to consider the importance of intersectionality, and also something that we always need to take into account, that there are power imbalances between business and communities and within communities itself. And now we'll pass the floor to Ni. Climate change impacts current and future generations, and we need to change the current course of action if future generations are to live in a livable planet, but also children and young people have all the right to live in a fair society and an economy now and in the future. So what are your perspectives on the Just Transition agenda? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ni, and I'm a member of the UNICEF East Asia and the Pacific Regional Office Young People's Action Team, and I'm also a climate activist in my country for a few years now. And for the Just Transition agenda, like to us youth advocates, I think that that's one thing that we talk a lot about, and we know that in our hearts that's something that we have to be a part of towards the way to the 1.5 Celsius degree part. But where do young people and children fit into this agenda that we're talking about? And the answer is simple. Children and youth are an essential part of the agenda, and we represent a diverse range of stakeholders. We face very complex and far-reaching consequences from the transition, but our voices and needs are often treated as a single entity and largely overlooked. And we have heard stories from our colleagues in various panels. We have children in the region who are directly affected by the transition, and as we shift towards electricity and sustainable energy, families are displaced from their ancestors' land due to mining activities or large-scale energy projects. And this disrupts children's education, health, safety, as we also seen from our panelists' part. And in some parts of the Asia and the Pacific, children are a part of the labor force in these sectors under unsafe and exploitative conditions. And I can tell you that like almost 200 years ago, during the first industrial revolution, children were also heavily exploited in coal mines. And we are repeating history, no matter how sustainable this transition claims to be, but it's not just. And beyond child labor, children of parents who are affected by the job's instability or economic shifts due to this transition is also deeply impacted. And even though they're not directly involved in business activities, their rights are also tied to the parents' rights. And it's similar to a domino effect. When you tip one, the other also tips. And not to mention that there's already ongoing marginalization with women in various industries in the transition. And those people that are also mother to the children in the field. And there's businesses who claim that we don't work with children, so what? But their actions are still affecting the children's lives in one way or another. And at the same time, we have to look at how businesses are approaching sustainability, because shifting to circular economy is also in one aspect of the transition. Many more companies are adopting environmentally friendly practices, promoting recycling, reducing carbon footprints. We heard that a lot, which is a very positive step. But often they're also the ones who are still driving excessive consumption. And you can actually see this in the market for the children and youth, where advertisements are targeting us everywhere. And this creates a cycle where businesses continue to drive excessive consumption. And they expect the consumers to pay to abate the emissions, manage the waste, the environmental and human rights consequences. And this poses a question, like, shouldn't businesses be more accountable for their environmental impacts if they're driving us to consumer, and especially if they're targeting people at a very young age to do that? And as children and youth, we are navigating a system that we don't build, but our futures are heavily influenced by it, but we also don't have actual rights to decide, and we are the one expected to clean up the mess. Opting out of the society is impossible, and that's why it's a must to include children and youth as equal partners when it comes to decision-making for just transition. So where do we go from here? How do we make sure that children and youth voices are heard in policymaking, and not just in tokenistic ways, but also meaningfully and respected for each individual? First, we have to make sure that children have access. There's a lot of accesses, but without access, there's no equity, and without equity, there's also no justice. Access to information, access to avenues that can enable them to raise their voices, and access to remedial processes. Accessibility is a fundamental right and a necessary condition to meaningful participation and a key priority in the Just Transition agenda. Information empowers and enables children to proactively act upon the agenda that they consider that are important. Access to age-appropriate content is also extremely important when it comes to children, because in the past few sessions, I saw a lot of children here participating with us, but most of the time they look very confused. And because we're so busy talking about transition, economies, justice, remedies for children, but we're forgetting that it's crucial to have the child understand those to be able to raise anything regards to their rights. And for us youth, just transition is a novel topic to many, but we have to quickly adapt and absorb the expertise that many professionals here have gained over the decades, and often as long as we've been alive, just to be taken seriously at these spaces. And it's never enough to simply inform children, because they need safe avenues which they can express their concerns and ideas, be heard, and have their voice translated to meaningful action. These avenues must be officially provided to youth, and that's not a thing that you think that's good to have, it has to be. And easily accessed without the need to pass through an agency. I am privileged enough to have the chance to access information and be invited to sit here talking about the things I care about in a second language that's not my mother tongue. But I am also aware that many are locked out of these opportunities due to their gender, disabilities, discrimination, geographic isolation, and a lack of access to education and digital tools, or simply it's the obstacle from our very top-down structure in Asia and the Pacific that us youth and children are expected to listen to adults, and most definitely activism is not a thing that's praised. It's a sad reality that millions of children around the world don't have the privilege to access basic information or the platform to speak out, and it's those very children who often suffer the most from the consequences of climate change and social injustice. Next, we need to improve accountability. How? After the stages above, we need to have children listened to and not just put on your reports that, yeah, you consult the children in the Just Transition policy, and so what? We never know where our voices will go to and what will happen after. And as children and youth, we are already having a lot of anxiety relating to climate change, and we're depressed by the future that happens after. And giving us the silent treatment does not help that at all. I'm also organizing programs for children and youth on climate action, and I can tell you that every single time we have Q&As, feedbacks, the questions that I receive the most is that, what is the outcome of our action? What does this lead to? Where do our voices go to? And does it make any impact on the policymakers? And my responses will always be, I'm trying to push that. I'm trying to push our voice to be recognized. It will be going to the ministry, and this year it's going to the RBHR forum. But what's happened next, I'm also unsure because I'm a young person. It's the institution's choice to decide and to have us as your partners for this agenda to co-create solutions. To wrap it up, ensuring the children ensuring that children are meaningfully included in conversations is crucial. We need to push for a transition that holds institutions accountable and empowers children and young people to actively participate in a safe and an enabling environment to build a sustainable future for everyone. Thank you, and I will be handing back to the moderator.
Thank you, Ni, for speaking so passionately and eloquently about the impacts of the transition to a green economy on children and young people and what you need to happen to be a really, truly just and equitable transition. So before I open the floor, I want to share some of UNICEF's initial perspectives on the connection between child rights and just transition. It's, in case you were wondering, I'm not a young person, but a young person at heart. It's, after all the speakers, I will just give you a brief overlook of some of the initial thinking that UNICEF and perspective that we have, because we are conducting research to understand how the shifts necessary to the green transition impacts children's rights and how this can be addressed through government and business action. And so I just want to complement the intervention of the previous panelists and give some of the ideas. You've heard from Ni how families are being displaced and how these affect children's right to education, to safety, and to health. How some of the children are being exploited in the mining activities of some of those minerals that are needed for the clean technologies that are necessary for the green economy. And the increase in demand of these minerals will likely increase the risk for children if these are not identified and addressed adequately. But also consider how the disappearance of industries and jobs for new greener industrial jobs will have an impact on workers, on communities, and on households, including on children. If households are not adequately supported, they will lose income. And when households lose income, there is a risk of pushing children into poverty, which impedes them from realizing their rights and risks pushing them into more exploitative forms of labor because they feel the need to support the income of their households. We were speaking about circularity of the economy. There is an increase in demand and expectation for more recycling and for the use of more recycled products. But child labor in the waste recycling has also been reported in some sectors. And these expose children to toxic substances that put their health at risk with potential lifelong consequences. So these are some of these unintended consequences that I was speaking at the beginning that are linked to the green transition. And when governments or businesses adopt policies or strategies related to the green transition, they rarely consider how this can affect children. And equally, when just transition strategies are developed, the rights, needs, and views of children are rarely taken into consideration. We need urgent action to address the impact of climate change. That is out of question. But we need a urgent action that goes hand in hand with respect for human rights and children's rights. And this is possible. States have an obligation to protect, respect, and fulfill children's rights, including in the context of just transition. And businesses have the responsibility to respect children's rights as they transition into the green economy. Considering children's rights in just transition is not optional, but the inclusion of children's rights in just transition does not happen automatically. So we need deliberate and proactive actions from governments and businesses to recognize the importance and relevance of child rights and to remediate child rights abuses when these occur. And so to achieve this, we need 4 key actions. First, we need children and their rights to be visible. States need to explicitly ground just transition strategies, policies, and legislation in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and assess the impacts on children connected with their initiatives to drive the transition to the green economy. Businesses need to have policies and strategy in place based on human rights and environmental due diligence that considers the root causes of adverse impacts on child rights. Secondly, we need children to be heard and their views to be acted on. You've heard it from me. What happens after our views are collected? States and business should engage meaningfully and safely with children and young people to better understand the impacts on them and better design strategies and responses that are effective for children's rights. And this can happen directly or through their legitimate representatives. Thirdly, we need to break the silos between the environment and social pillars. Environmental and climate impacts on children are intertwined with social impacts on children and vice versa. Strategy, policies, and actions need to reflect this interconnection. And lastly, child-responsive due diligence should be at the basis of any business action related to the green transition. Child-responsive due diligence in human rights and environmental due diligence that address the root causes of child rights deprivation. Businesses and society are undertaking systemic changes in order to switch to a green economy. And as they undertake these changes, they can and must change their business models, strategies, and operations to embed respect for child rights from the beginning, so they can contribute to ensuring a livable planet and a fair society. Thank you. I would like now to open the floor for the participants. We want to hear from you if you have questions and your views on 2 points. What do you think are the biggest challenges for governments and business to include child rights in the Just Transition agenda? And what is the one thing that could ensure the inequalities for children are not exacerbated in the green transition? I see Amanda on the second row, please.
A very good evening to everyone. It is indeed a very important session because it is a matter of future generations to come, and we really want to leave something for them on a very good note and on a very healthy note, so that for their survival and obviously not at the risk part, but obviously they can live further and live healthy on a good note. So basically, I'm from India. I'm Gautam Bhardwaj. I'm a practicing lawyer. And I've been dealing with child-related issues back in India. And in fact, I just want to add one thing, like I was just listening to the speakers over there, like we all are young. Yes, indeed. In fact, one of the honorable judges back in High Court over there in India, even he mentioned one particular thing, that we all are young at different age groups. So we all are young, basically, no doubt about it. So let me just come to the topic now. It is basically with regard to the risk and the opportunities. So what I believe in with regard to the risk is it is actually because of the socio-economic part, the political part, and as well as the geographical circumstances, the location, what we talk about. These are the basic, what I think, these are the 3 things upon which we really rely upon. And accordingly, the risk factor comes up. The risk is with regard to the child. Like the child becomes a victim of child beggary, or the child can become a victim of human trafficking, or maybe a victim of forced child labor, even be it in the chemical factories or wherever, or even in the minings also, or maybe a victim of violence, exploitation, or maybe an abuse and neglect which leads to a shortened life and a poor and physical mental health condition, and as well as the educational problems. A child can be a dropout from schools as well. So these are the risks, what I believe are being faced even now. And the opportunities which we talk about is actually irrespective of their color, maybe caste, maybe the language. It should be on a neutral note, and a friendly conditions should be developed for their growth, both physically and mentally, and just to protect their rights as well, right? And the most important part, what I really consider is that all the stakeholders should actually organize some kind of a sensitization programs on equal platforms, and just to make aware, not only with regard to the parental side, but even on the communal side as well. Because we see children on the streets, we see children in schools, they are being abused, both physically, both mentally, but nothing conclusive comes up. They just remain victims. They don't share anything because of the fear, what they deal with, what all they actually come across, the trauma they have. So accordingly, the counseling part should be there at a very initial stage. If any of the victims we deal with at the rescue level, so that very moment, what I believe is that it is, I'm being centric, not being particular. So everywhere, I think there should be a counselor at the time of rescue of a child victim at that point of time, so that it will be very easy for that child, that at least on a friendly note, someone is there to help him or her out, right? So these are my suggestions on this, if you can consider this part of mine. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much. I have Prem in front, and we'll take few questions from the floor, and then so Prem here on the first row, and then I have two people at the last row. One person here in front, one young person here in front. Okay, yes, go Prem. Yep.
Sure, thank you very much for great presentations from the presenter. My name is Prem Rajasurang, and I'm a children and a youth. It was great to hear one of your questions is on how states and how government can better address children's rights. I think the children's rights need to empower the community, need to empower everyone around children, not only children, but their parents, their teachers, their communities, to know about their rights, to know about children's rights, and children has to know about their rights, to be able to have children's rights at the center at every decision making. But one of the issues related to the businesses that I would like to mention is on overconsumption. When overconsumption from businesses, when you say about mining, when there are practices of overconsumption that lead to a more resources, taking more resources from the world, and I think that's really impacting children. We need more market that prioritize quality over than quantity. When we talk about EV battery on the just transition, you don't just need more nickel, but you just need a nickel in an industry that it can be more effective. An EV car can use more than 5 to 10 years. That a long-lasting equipment to have more quality in their industry. So this needs more research, development, technology, innovation. This is where young people can engage. This is where there are opportunities. And children are the true game changers to change these problems and to address the global issues, such as from microplastic in our body, from what we can do to protect the real children's rights that will enhance in a long-term development. And I'm sure this is an intersectional and need to collaborate with all of us here. And I believe that in the future, children are the heroes for a more just, equitable, and resilient world. Thank you.
Thank you. Pretty unconscious of time, so I'm giving more space to the floor. So we have two people there in the back, and then the person here in front at the central on the first row. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first of all, I thank Anita, the panelist, who brought the whole issue of social marginalization, exclusion, and discrimination. Probably I've heard the first time in the entire forum somebody bringing so explicitly about these matters. And my name is Ajay Kumar. I represent an alliance of climate frontline communities. And we are the one who actually suffer the brunt of the problem of the climate change. I don't want to use the word disproportionately affected. We are actually affected hierarchically because the community are from historically excluded background, like Dalits, Adivasis, fishing communities, pastoralite communities, the mountain people, and our children are particularly affected. And it is in a kind of an intergenerational issue that we are facing, especially in the context of climate-induced events and disasters. So I would like to suggest only one thing. The word inclusion becomes so irrelevant in terms of, it's remain as a jargon. Either we need to invent a new word, or we have to qualify this word, from an equity and justice framework, or something like a restorative inclusion. That's what we demand. Thank you very much.
Hi. Firstly, thank you for this panel. It's been a wonderful and insightful session. I am Padmaja. I represent Global March Against Child Labor. We are a global coalition with a vision of creating and sustaining a global child labor-free zone. And I have a question more than a remark. I think, Pichaman, most of us, if not all, would definitely resonate with the very fact that there is indeed a growing voices, there is indeed growing voices of children and youth today across different levels. However, we are not yet there with an effective and sustainable blueprint. So therein lies my question. What, in your experience, what have been some of the effective and sustainable strategies to include or engage children and youth and their voices in the developmental processes? Yes, so that would be great to not only from, would be good to know it from all of you. Thank you so much. That's it.
Yeah, very good evening. I am representing from India, and my name is Gita Srikor. I'm just asking UNICEF for one suggestion. Recently, like last month, on 14th August, there was an incident in the eastern part of India where 2 school buses were hijacked, and there were more than 80+ students, and there are students even from class nursery and class 1, very small students. And it was hijacked because there was a discussion with the school authority and the bus authority, and to fulfill the demand, the bus authority hijacked the 2 buses, and even the school authority knew about it, and there was no connectivity with the bus which were full of students for more than 2-3 hours. And after the demand was fulfilled, they were like sent back to home, and they didn't attend the school that day. So it's a very sensitive matter when it comes to the threat of a life and security of children. So what UNICEF can do with that, and I will really request everyone to kindly look into the matter, because children today are the future of tomorrow. So if there's a threat like that and hijacked it, and it's like in the daytime the 2 buses were hijacked, no one knows where the 80 students were taken, and the matter I already informed the police and all, but no one acted correctly in that. So kindly suggest me what I can do with that and what UNICEF can do in that.
Thank you. Pichoma, do you want to answer the question? And I'll go back.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for everyone who asked a question and provided comments that were very insightful, and also words of support for better integrating children's rights into the business and human rights agenda. To the question about what are sustainable strategies to engage children and youth, I mean, this is perhaps a question that you can address as well as an actual young person. But I would say from the working group's own observations, and based on what we see and what we hear from stakeholders and other UN entities that engage with us, I think it's, a sustainable strategy is one that focuses not just on the outcomes, whether immediate or long-term, but also focuses on building better practices, better processes. And here I'm reflecting on, in the Asia-Pacific region, Asia in particular, national action plans on business and human rights have been, quite popular in the sense that, governments have been adopting national action plans on business and human rights, certainly in the Southeast Asian region, and there are a few more that are contemplating issuing national action plans in the near future. I know that colleagues at UNICEF have been working diligently to try and bring in children's voices into the NAP design and development processes, not without challenges. But to me, it's that type of strategy where it's not just about bringing children and young people in at the end of the process to get them to say, yes, this is a good thing that you just did, have them validated, and then it goes back to the point about tokenism and box ticking, but to actually have them part of the process, for them to inform the co-creation of these national action plans, of both mandatory and voluntary measures in the business and human rights space. To me, it's changing the way in which we do meaningful multi-stakeholder engagement so that children and young people are invited into the room. How to do that? I mean, I think the speakers here on the session have highlighted the unique accessibility challenges that children and young people face, whether it be the case that they're not taken seriously at all times, or really also because they're located in far-flung regions or remote communities, and they don't have the ability on their own to actually come to consultations in the flesh. I think this is where we, as a business and human rights community, owe it to them to find the resources to help bring them into the discussion, into the dialogue, and have their voices embedded into the process. So to me, this is absolutely integral, and it also addresses that issue about inclusion becoming just a buzzword, an empty signifier, and I agree, there's a real tendency, a real risk for us to treat inclusion like, as soon as you say something's inclusive, it doesn't mean that it's actually inclusive, and we've seen so many examples of that. So I think it's, I probably wouldn't go as far as to say let's scrap the word inclusion entirely. I think what it means is that we need to add substance to the concept itself, and part of that is truly paying attention to those groups, the rights holders who are the most marginalized and who are the most at risk, and that means bringing them into the room, as I keep saying. I think I've only really answered at an abstract level the question about what sustainable strategies are required. But I think having engaged with youth myself in my other capacity, I'm an academic, so I've engaged with a lot of young people in my other life. I think they have the energy and the wherewithal. I don't see it having ever been an issue trying to tell young people, come and join this event. If anything, they're so ready and willing to participate. Sometimes in the case of my students, it's also with the assurance that there will be a nice lunch waiting for them as well. But that's beside the point. But it's really not difficult to encourage and mobilize young people's participation in these processes. So really, I think we need to set up the systems, the platforms, the mechanisms to bring them in. And they have already indicated in so many different fora and opportunity and engagements that they would welcome those opportunities. And I don't mean to say they in a generalized sense, but I think that passion and that wherewithal is certainly there. So I think I'll hand it to you to perhaps address what more can be done.
Thank you so much for your intervention. When addressing this question, I also think that there's no one strategy to solve everything. Like for children and youth, as I have already addressed, we are compromised of so many groups, various groups of stakeholders. We are very diverse. And even children's clothes have different sizes for those who are 6 to 8 and 8 to upper. So there's no solution that can address the whole group of children and youth. Before I was a youth advocate for climate change, I was also doing advocacy for people with disabilities. And one thing that we really mention and stress a lot is the autonomy of a person. And that I think expands more than on the inclusion. We just don't include people for the sake of having them there. We also need to include them so they can operate, they can work on the solutions themselves. And I've already mentioned in my part where I say that we need to have spaces for children children and youth can go there without the need of an agency to be there. And that's very important because for me here, I cannot be here without the need for UNICEF that's inviting me to be here. And we need more spaces, more opportunities for us to can be there legally. And yeah, I think that's what I wanted to stress the most. I'm wondering if our two panelists have any other ideas on that? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Pichama, and thank you, Ni. I think there was one comment for UNICEF. Thanks for sharing the information about this accident. Unfortunately, I cannot comment on it because I do not know all the details. So it will be. I'm not in a position to provide any specific comment on this. But what I can tell you is that what can UNICEF do? UNICEF works both with governments, with businesses, with non-state actors, and we work in order to ensure that all children's rights are protected and respected, that states uphold their obligations to protect children's rights from violence, to protect children's rights to education, and that non-state actors, be that a business or anyone else, also knows children's rights and respect them. So that's unfortunately I cannot comment the specific case, but thank you for sharing it. If there are no other questions from the floor, then I'll pass it to Pichamo for the closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. It's me again. I promise I won't ramble on, let's just put it that way. I think what's been made abundantly clear from this session, as well as from the insights that have been shared from the floor, is that our discussion is very much centered on kind of the bigger picture issues that we find in relation to ensuring that children's rights and children and young people themselves are visible, are integrated into the business and human rights movement. And I would say that these bigger picture issues that we've discussing are important for us to engage with in relation to the energy transition, as well in relation to a range of other children's business and human rights issues, because they speak to the profoundly problematic, the deeper systemic barriers that children, that young people continue to face when it comes to accessing remedy, but also when it comes to ensuring corporate accountability for children's rights harm. And so I would say we're still at that level of trying to address these deeper seated issues, right? And until we can make progress on them, I think a lot of the solutions that might be proffered in relation to specific issue areas might not be as sustainable as they could be. And so until we truly do that, I think there will continue to be challenges, but I do hope that in 10 years' time, we won't be repeating the same things that we've said today, that we won't be talking about tokenism, that we won't be talking about the discrimination of young people, that we won't be talking about the homogenous treatment of children and young people when talking about their rights and their needs. But I would also like to use this opportunity to spotlight two key things. The first is that, as our speakers have already noted, there are cascading adverse impacts on children when it comes to the broader business-related human rights abuses that we see. When a worker is abused, and if they have a family, that abuse can send shockwaves throughout the entire family, right? It can send shockwaves throughout the entire community. So it's that wider perspective that we have to bear in mind as well in terms of how we conceptualize the risks and the impacts that are adverse and that can be generated for children. It's also the case that this is important for considerations of how businesses undertake human rights due diligence. Children's rights are human rights, and so as part of any human rights due diligence process, children's rights must also be integrated into that, in considerations of the immediate, the visible and not so visible adverse impacts on their rights must be considered by businesses too. And it's also important to remember that the positive steps taken by businesses, whether it be, I don't know what, there were some examples you were mentioning, right? Organizing events for young people and bringing their voices to the table, all of that is great. But those positive actions do not offset the adverse actual or potential human rights impacts that a business operations or its relationships have on children. So human rights due diligence addresses those negative impacts, those adverse impacts, and it's important for us and for businesses not to conflate corporate social responsibility, as it has traditionally been known as, with the actual conduct of human rights due diligence. And then the final point that I wanted to focus on is really the persecution of youth human rights defenders, those who are working at the forefront of combating the adverse impacts of climate change and also challenging the problematic discourses that we hear around the energy transition. And certainly here in the Asia-Pacific region, we are seeing how young people are being persecuted, how they are facing very real physical risks when they advocate, when they raise their voices on these issues, and this is simply an unacceptable situation. So my very final words here would be that I think if you are a young person listening to this, and indeed to the young people in the room, including my colleague on my left, please know that we as the current generation, we as older people, our responsibility is to you. It's to protecting, to respecting your rights. And the burden that you are currently bearing is not yours alone to bear. It is ours too. So you can certainly count on the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights to continue to raise this issue in the forums, in the conversations, in the meetings that we have with states and businesses, with other UN entities. And I know that colleagues of UNICEF who have organized this important session would feel the same way. So don't hesitate to reach out, but also don't hesitate to call us out if we're doing things in a way that feels tokenistic or if we're not doing enough, because we need you to be our moral conscience as well to ensure that we actually realize the implementation of the UN guiding principles for this generation, but also for future generations. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for participating to the session, for sharing your views. Thank you to the panelists for sharing their experience and their knowledge. And so we bring the session to a close, and have a good evening, everyone, and good morning or night to everyone online. Thank you so much.